Okay, I think we can get started. This week, we will have the speaker, who is my master student, Tyler, and he's also the online environmental science student and is going to graduate this semester. And today he's going to share his journey of like studying in the environmental science program and what kind of things he has done, especially for his capstone project. Here you go, Tyler.
Okay. Hey, well, yep, I'm Tyler, and Professor Ming here is my major professor, and I took this class a while back, and that's how I met Professor Ming. And let's try not to say that too many times. I haven't ever taught this in a lecture format, so I'm going to do my best. So bear with me, everyone. But this project is about bioethanol, and it's about waste to energy, and producing this at a residential sector. So, just in some acreage, or in my case, in a very small amount of land in my backyard.
Yeah, Tyler, you can you speak a little bit louder?
Oh, yeah. Um, yeah. Can you hear me better now?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
I can move the mic down if I have to, but I turned up the volume. I hope that. All right. Okay, so a little introduction. I was born and raised in Orlando. I've been in Boise for 10 years. Lived in Orlando for 27. Been a business owner and laborer for 17. 3 years I worked in hospitals. I decided to go back to school after COVID. And, I've been talking about ethanol for the better part of 15 years. I've always believed that it could be a fuel. I got that from a lecture by David Bloom, and if anybody wants to ever find a lecture from him, I encourage you to do so. You might have to go through DuckDuckGo, though, because Google seems to censor him. So, but if you can find a lecture, he's pretty cool to listen to. Anyways, I had ENVS 501 in 2022, and I listened to a lecture by Dr. Wang, and it was partially to do with ethanol and renewable fuels, and I got really into that discussion thread and started emailing Professor Ming on the side. And at that point, I was also taking my 1 credit capstone class, and I decided then that since I'd been talking about ethanol for so long, maybe that was the way to go for my capstone. So we'll move along here. Anyway, so ethanol is obviously an old practice. The furthest that we can really date it back to that we know of is ancient Egypt and China, and it was known as the water of history. It had various uses that they could have utilized ethanol for, like antidotes and anesthetics, stings for bites, stuff like that. It was first distilled by the wife of the first dynasty of China, of King Yu. The Latin word for spirits is spiritus, which means breath or essence, because when we distill ethanol, it comes off in a vapor form, and that looked pretty mystical back in the day, and they thought it had magical powers. It was the breath of the gods, turning metals into gold. All right, so we get into some of the old traditions, histories, and usages of it. It was ethanol was first made pure in 1796, so 200 proof or 100% alcohol by volume by Johann Lowitz, and then 80 years later, Nicholas Otto was the inventor of a 4-cycle engine that ran on ethanol, and it was called the Otto engine. Henry Ford was a farmer by childhood. Obviously, we know him for making the first automobile. And his entire enterprise was built around making cars run on multiple fuels at that time era. Back in the early 1900s, it was easier to fill up with ethanol than it was on gasoline. Ethanol was just more readily available. Anyways, D. Rockefeller funded in many ways prohibition from 1920 to 1933, and it wasn't necessarily that people couldn't consume alcohol. It was about the production of alcohol on a residential sector. So you couldn't produce ethanol with a still or a mash or stuff like that. But obviously people were still drinking. They just weren't allowed to produce it. anyways, he funded that with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, gave them $4 million. Today, that would be around $100 million, and they lobbied Congress to get that passed, and they did so. Private citizens at that point lost the ability to grow out technology with ethanol. So there's a lot of stuff on this slide. I'm not going to read it all, but it's really important because in the early 1900s, there were thousands of tests that were performed on ethanol. You know, in 1906, performing efficiency tests of alcohol engines. You know, they could be modified for a higher power and pure alcohol fuel. Despite a smaller heat or BTU value of ethanol to a gallon of gasoline, you could alter the internal combustion engine by giving it a higher compression ratio, which would then give you the same amount of mileage that a higher BTU value of gasoline had. So there were ways to work around the power format. U.S. Geological Service and U.S. Navy performing 2,000 tests on 1907, 1908. Obviously, their remarks were about cleanliness, you know, no smoke or disagreeable odors. You know, it was just a very efficient fuel. So you can read through some of these on your own time, but the ones that are kind of important are number 6. So back in the day, engines used to knock due to the lower octane fuel and a misfire from the internal combustion engine. So when it would misfire or try to ignite the fuel before the piston made it all the way down, it would create this knocking sound. Well, that knocking sound was solved by ethanol because it's naturally a high octane fuel of 130. So when you would blend it with the gasoline, they got rid of the knocking sound and everything went well. But that would soon be sort of obsolete as General Motors, DuPont, and Standard Oil would come together, and they would really disregard all the research that they were doing on their own for ethanol, so that they could then bring in like epitetrol lead, which also solved the knocking. But at that point, lead would then be in our gasoline for the next 70 years. Another really big slide. These are just some points that are worth noting. You know, hundreds of thousands of miles were covered in standard motor cars, tractors, boats, airplanes on ethanol. The superiority of alcohol and gasoline fuels is safely established. And then the American petroleum industry gets involved and they start running counter information. You know, alcohol is inferior, you know, blah, blah, blah. One of my favorite ones is the oil industry technologists and automotive engineers know that it is not as satisfactory a fuel as straight gasoline of normal quality. I just think that's kind of a funny quote, not very convincing, but they got the message through. And also another important one, number 5, alcohol from cellulose was already being worked on in the early 1900s. That's kind of a new pathway today where we're trying to use lignosic material or wood stalks and corn stover, where we're breaking this material down that doesn't necessarily have carbohydrates available to us the way it is. We have to split that material through hydrolysis to get the fermentable sugars out of it. And they were doing that, you know, 100 years ago with acid, sulfuric acid or vinegar. All right, so this is the beginning of how I started my process. And just a little background, I have a 1,000 square foot garden. It's a lot of work, and I have numerous fruit trees that I've planted every year that I've lived here for the last 10 years. So I have a lot of fruit trees. And this is all about feedstock preparation. So we're looking for starches, we're looking for sugars. And if I had the type of facility, I guess I could look for lignosic cellulosic materials like agricultural waste, but I can't do that here. It's a little bit too difficult. So in my, what I'm looking for is like potatoes, corn, wheat, sugar cane, sugar beets, stuff like that, fruit. But in general, we have our starches. These are all starches that can be turned into ethanol. Sugars are very simple to turn into ethanol. And then lignocellulosic waste. And then we gather all of that mash and we transport it to a facility where it can then be processed. And that leads us into step 2, which is the conversion process. And it's the pre-treatment of biomass. So real quick on these photos, obviously this is my biomass, a lot of apples you see, there's a lot of strawberries and grapes and pears and just a lot of fruit type material. I performed acid hydrolysis on this material on the stove in the pressure cooker. So a little bit of pressure with a little bit of acid, and the acid that I used was vinegar. And under that acid hydrolysis, you break open some of those polysaccharide sugars and hopefully turn them into mono. There's also enzymatic hydrolysis, and you get into this as well, and I did with working with enzymes like cellulase, alpha amylase, glucoamylase. These are enzymes that will help to break down the more complex structures of the sugars to make them fermentable for your yeast. Now, when we're using like woody residues in dedicated energy crops like the corn stover, that can be difficult. So they use steam expulsion, and it's basically a big vat of high pressured steam. So it's really high pressure, a little, quite a bit of steam, but for not that long of a time, almost like a flash steam. But when they remove that pressure, it opens up the vessels of the cellulosic material of the plant structure and allows those sugars to now become available. Kind of like the same when a diver comes from really deep underwater and they come up too fast, they get the bends and their blood boils. It's the same concept. Pressure causes that to rupture open, and then we have something to work with. So fermentation, this is a fun step, and there's a lot of different yeasts that can be used out there on the market to ferment your mash once you've ran it through acid hydrolysis and enzymatic hydrolysis. We then let it cool, and we bring it over to the fermenters. So one thing to sort of note on these fermenters, there's 2 6-gallon buckets here, and on top they have a little clear air vent there, and that's where the carbon dioxide is going to vent out as we ferment the mash into ethanol. So we can actually catch that CO2 right away by putting a balloon over the top of that airlock, and we can capture that CO2 so that it doesn't go into the atmosphere and be more of an issue for global warming. And we could then reallocate it, say sequester it deep underground, or it can just be sequestered back into the soil of farmland, enriching the crops that are growing on that farmland, or pumped into a greenhouse. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the most common yeast used to make alcohol. It's also known as baker's yeast, but today yeast can be genetically engineered to be highly robust, and you can get as much as 20% or 10 proof from your fermentation bucket. And there are some yeasts that get you up to 20 proof or 40%, and they can tolerate that type of alcohol content before it sort of chokes them out. And that's really important if we're looking for efficiency. So moving on to step 4, the distillation process. So I got a lot of photos in here, and we're going to have another slide full of photos as well, but I'm trying to move that out of the way. Anyways, I have a lot of ways to distill. Obviously, I tried a lot of different things, and some of it failed, some of it worked. But there's reflux stills, pot stills, continuous column stills, double pot stills, azeotropic distillation, and that involves using some volatile organic compounds that alter boiling points and allow ethanol to come out more pure. But the goal is to completely separate the ethanol from the wash that's been fermented. So you have your wash, and it's kind of like a really strong wine. So then we pour it into the boiler, which in this case, you can see the keg right there, or on the burner are the boilers. You pour that wash into the boiler, and then you bring the temperature up to about 172 degrees and try to hold it at that. And that's the temperature at which ethanol will boil. So the ethanol will boil out of the water before the water will boil at the 212. But also when you build these, they're under a little bit of pressure just by the design and the fact that they're airlocked. So that little bit of pressure will raise the boiling point of water, so you have a little bit more room to work with. And the water won't boil off right at 212. It will start boiling a little bit higher, and also depending on elevation from where you live. Might be going a little fast here. I don't know. Sorry. But so real quick before we move to the next slide, the bottom picture here, that copper coil is going to come into play. It's also what you see with the hoses coming out of the picture right next to it at the top column. That copper coil is a reflux coil. I had to fill that with sand and wrap it around just a mop handle. That was really difficult to wrap, but essentially when the ethanol vapors come up that column, they're going to make contact with that big coil there, and that coil has cold water running through it, and it will knock the ethanol vapors back down, allowing them to rest on the packing that's in the column, and then they'll re-boil off of that packing and come back up more pure. And eventually we'll get to the place where they'll escape that coil, and then they'll make it out the right T coming off of that column and down into the condenser. And hopefully we'll get it to 180, 185 proof. All right, so step 5, this is our dehydration phase. And so typically to get ethanol to 180 proof isn't the hardest thing ever, but to go from 180 proof to say 190 proof, it requires, you know, exponentially more energy. So we want to find ways to save the energy in so that the ethanol that we're getting is worth using. Instead of just turning our boiler on as high as we can, we want to try to save that energy for efficiency. So then we use dehydration. So if you get your alcohol or ethanol up to 180 proof or 90%, we can then use molecular sieves. And these are really cool. They come in clay, ceramic beads, zeolite. But basically, the molecular sieve is going to be specific as to what it wants to take out. They have different sizes. And I don't know a lot about this as I'm not a chemist, but an angstrom is a term used in chemistry and science, and that's going to be a diameter. So an H2O molecule has an angstrom of 2.75, and an ethanol molecule has an angstrom of 3.6. And so these molecular sieves come in different sizes, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A. So essentially 3A is 3 angstrom in size. That's how big the pores are that are in these little, you know, beads and pellets that you see there. And so those pores will only allow water to be absorbed in, but not the ethanol. So we can take our ethanol and pour a bunch of these beads in, and they will just pull the water out, and we can pour out the ethanol, take those beads, and then dehydrate them in an oven, or you can dehydrate them under a vacuum. So you can start a vacuum and then open the vacuum, and we should be able to expel all the moisture out of them, but I don't have the equipment for that, so I can only dehydrate them in the oven. But they can then be reused again. So it's something that's reusable. They're not exactly cheap, and there are a lot of ways to dehydrate ethanol. You can use copper sulfate, you can use calcium carbonate, lime, and there are some new ways that I read about not too long ago that were being researched in the late 80s and early 90s, and that was to actually use cornmeal as essentially as like a molecular sieve. So you would have a column that the ethanol vapors pass through, and it's also another way to do azeotropic distillation. But the corn would then pass through a column, or the ethanol vapor would pass through a column of cornmeal, and the cellulosic material of that cornmeal has the potential to absorb the H2O out of the corn, leading to really high ethanol content on the other side without the additional energy input. And that's really important. I think that we probably haven't done enough on looking at what other types of cellulosic materials can pull H2O out of ethanol easier. But corn seems to work for that. And it was found out by accident. Okay, so step 6 is just the refining of the ethanol. Once we have it at 200 proof or 100%, it's then put through a denatured process, and this is going to be dependent upon the consumer's use. Often, ethanol is just denatured with gasoline or methanol, and it goes into fuel. And but you can denature it with all kinds of stuff, with benzenes and whatever else you want to do with it. But basically, the point is to make it undrinkable so that humans don't go and steal all the ethanol and try to whatever have fun with it. Anyways, then it's reprocessed and stored, and then it's put out to meet regulatory requirements of the purity. Okay, so environmental and societal benefits. So 2 pictures here. Obviously, I just want to give you a description of these. The glass on the left contains 10 milliliters of gasoline, and the glass cup on the right contains 10 milliliters of ethanol. I think it was like 187 or 190 proof, so pretty close to pure, 90%. As you can see, after they've been burned, they're very different. And I should say that the ethanol, it burned for roughly 5 to 6 minutes, and it burned clear and very hot. The gasoline burned explosively, and it only burned for about 20 seconds. And what it left was a bunch of unspent energy. That's essentially what that is inside that glass jar there. It's all of the unspent energy or the energy waste of that fuel. And so ethanol burns slower and more completely with no waste. And the ethanol smelled like fruit. The gasoline clearly would smell putrid, as you can imagine. All right, so to bridge the gap between fossil fuels, contribute to carbon neutrality. This is we could have a huge reduction in VOCs if this was adopted for the transportation sector, and we'll get to that in a second. But it's something that should have been adopted 100 years ago. But politics, it's great for recycling biomass. We have a lot of biomass. We have a lot of food that just gets put in landfills, and a lot of it makes it to cattle for feed, and we'll talk about that as well. But it could go to ethanol plants, ethanol plants inside county limits. Every 3 or 5 counties would have an ethanol plant. And your garbage man, when they come and collect the garbage, they also collect the grass clippings and all the sticks and leaves and your fall cleanup. This is all material that can be broken down and sent to an ethanol plant to be hydrolyzed and fermented, turning into ethanol. CO2 is captured easily during the process of the fermentation and reallocated. We covered that. Also, leftover ethanol waste. So the dried distiller's grains is what we call the mash. After we pull all the ethanol out of it, we drain it out. The water evaporates off once we clean everything out. We have a bunch of mash, whether that's corn mash or whether it's potato mash. It still has fat, it still has minerals, and it still has proteins in it. The only thing that this mash doesn't have in it anymore is carbohydrates and sugars. And cattle don't do well eating starch. Their stomachs aren't designed to eat corn. They're designed to eat grass. They have the enzymes in their stomachs to break down the cellulase in grass, and that's what they're designed to eat. So when we feed our cattle corn, it actually poses a problem for them. They bloat, they become unhealthy. They have to have more veterinarian bills, no doubt. They just don't tolerate starch. So when we pull the ethanol out of our mash, there is no more sugar left in that. So when we feed that dried distiller grain to the cattle, it actually will do better for our cattle. 1 pound of dried distiller's grains it increases the weight that cattle can gain exponentially. It's really cool on that. It makes a lot of sense, and it's just more nutritious. But then on the backside of that, we can take the methane from the cattle and use microorganisms to ferment for additional the manure to make methane, and then the methane to fire the ethanol still, and it can be a closed loop system. So there's a lot that can be done with this that we don't really seem to do. But moving on. All right, so these are a bunch of pictures. I just put this slide in to show you this was a lot of work. You know, I put a lot of work into the ideas in the building, but these two images on the side, that is my final build. And you can see in some of the images, I have copper coils going into these worm buckets of cold water, and that condenses the ethanol vapors. But that's essentially what I've built with the long copper column coming off of the still. It's a condenser column, and I have cold water that runs into the beginning of that condenser, and there's a tube inside that copper tube, and that's where the ethanol vapors are. And so the water will travel around the outside of that inner tube, and it will condense the ethanol vapors. And when that water is then pushed up into the top portion, it comes up to the reflux coil that I have that goes down the main column. And so there's a good picture of kind of how that looks. And the reason that I'm going to use the same water that goes into the condenser, because if I put too cold of water into that top column reflux coil, it's too powerful and it will knock down all of my ethanol vapors and I won't be able to get anything out of it. I might have built it too long. I probably should have shortened it. But so instead I found a way around that to send the water up. The water comes out slightly warm after condensing the ethanol in that copper tube, and then it runs up to my reflux column, and it's not as cold, so it doesn't knock as much back down, and it will start to let out some ethanol. And that's what we're looking for, a really low fire. I know that's a big boiler there that you see at the bottom, sitting on like a 15,000 BTU burner, but I barely have that burner running. Like if you dipped your head down and looked at the amount of flame coming out of it, it's very, very small. You don't have to run this thing high to make it efficient. The less heat you can use, the better. And then you just control your water and what you need to condense the vapors. And that's essentially how to do it with the least amount of energy that I've been able to find out. Now, technically, I could take my ethanol, turn it into a fuel mixture, and then light my boiler as well to continue running this process and then make it a closed loop system. But that would be additionally tough, and this was already tough. That's my son, my old son. So here's another backyard experiment. This was something that my little son saw and wanted to show me because it was about ethanol, and this was how to make gel fuel. And you know, we have chickens in the backyard, so we went ahead and tried to perform this experiment with the ethanol. And we take the eggshells of the chicken and we crush them up in a mortar and pestle, and then we cooked them in some water to try to cook out the calcium that was in the eggshell. And then we add a little bit of vinegar and we cook it some more, and the vinegar will change the calcium from the eggshell in a chemical reaction into a calcium acetate. And that's what you need to bond to ethanol to make gel fuel. So then once we make our calcium acetate, we then cook it and sort of reduce what we have in there because there's a lot of water and vinegar. So we want to reduce out some of that water and kind of like cooking this engine anyways. And then we filter it through a coffee filter and we get our calcium acetate from the eggshells. So in the two glasses on the bottom, I have real calcium acetate on the right. That's the clear fluid. And then I have the eggshell calcium acetate on the left. And then the next picture, it's kind of a watery gel. The eggshell worked. You know, maybe we should have reduced more water out of it. It was kind of watery gel, but it still worked. This is a great way to conserve ethanol if you're using it for some sort of fuel purpose. If you turn it into a gel fuel, that little bit of gel fuel on the tinfoil there will burn for about 18 minutes, a long time. It doesn't necessarily keep things at boiling temperature for that long. It starts to die out of its intensity around 10 or 11 minutes, but you get a much longer burn and you can, you know, use it for what you need it for. Moving on. All right, so what everybody wants to know, can you really use it in engines? Well, We discussed that in like the third slide with the hundreds of thousands of miles that were tested back in the early 1900s. Clearly, it was known as a superior fuel. So what I did was take this 10-year-old lawnmower and dump all the gasoline out of it. Well, there wasn't much because it was kind of winter at the time. And but anyway, so I sort of made a mess on my patio. But we filled it up with varying proofs, and we drained the carburetor, and then we started filling up the tank with ethanol. And at 170 proof, we did get it to light, and that's this video here. All right, so that shows that we got an ignition even at 170 proof, which still has quite a bit of water in it, but it couldn't stay on. Now, maybe if that was a brand new engine, or if that lawnmower engine was a little more update and had a higher compression ratio, we might have been able to keep that ignition on with the water that's in the fuel. But then we run 195 proof in it. All right, so that worked. And we also have it working. All right, that's enough of that. Hope that wasn't too loud for everyone, and I hope you could see that. I can see it on my end. So, Professor, could you see that?
Yes, the video is good, but the sound is kind of like off, so it's fine. Keep going.
Okay. All right, but it worked. Okay. So, moving on. Sorry. All right, so greenhouse gas potential. So as we know, ethanol for the most part is carbon neutral. Obviously, it still takes some energy to make it, but it's important to distinguish how we're getting our oil today. And if you all are taking some further energy courses, you'll find out soon enough that peak oil has kind of been reached. We were supposed to reach it back in the 90s and the 2000s, and then some oil wells refilled, and we were like, we're confused. But in general, right now, we're about to start getting our oil indefinitely from tar sands in Canada and the northern part of U.S., where these tar sands are, vastly available. But the amount of energy that it takes to pull the petroleum out of these tar sands is a lot higher. And they have to use natural gas to boil under the sands to make the tar come out. It's really a messy process, and it's totally horrible for the environment. But that's why they need oil to be at $100 a barrel, because it makes this effective for them to produce oil that way. And I'm not against oil. I want to say that. I'm not against it. I'm just against gasoline and the transportation sector. That's what I'm against. But so carbon neutral bioethanol is that. We're getting it from our crops. The crops are using photosynthesis. They're using carbon from the air, and they're using water, and they're making CO2, and they're putting it into the foliage of the plant. They're growing big. The additional CO2 is pumped into the soil, where fungi will then break that CO2 down into micronutrients, keeping that soil rich in the process with natural fertilizers. So then when we process that biomass for ethanol, we're capturing the majority of that CO2 that we're talking about that's in that green biomass. We're capturing that in the fermentation process. When ethanol is burned, it releases water and carbon, but it doesn't release VOCs. It doesn't release 150 some odd chemicals that are known to be highly toxic that are in gasoline. Remember, gasoline is a waste product of oil refineries. So in the beginning, when these cars were being built, when we were trying to figure out what gasoline was, all it was a waste product of refining petroleum. And it was often dumped into the Flint, Michigan River. We've all heard stories of how toxic that river was. It was caught on fire multiple times. And then for some reason in the 60s, they decided to use it for drinking water, and everyone got poisoned with lead because instead of using ethanol, they were using lead in the gasoline to get rid of the knocking effect of engines. But they dumped all this waste into the river because it wasn't being utilized, and they just had to get rid of it. Anyways, so we have lower CO2 emissions than gasoline per unit, and we're able to give back to nature what we take out. It also gives us a way to use all of this waste. Instead of this food making it to the dump, that food can make it to a precise location that can then ferment that and turn it into fuel instead of just turning it into waste. Permaculture is all about using everything. There is no waste. We have to learn to use stuff. And that's something that we need to figure out really quick, in my opinion. But also, nearly every region on the planet has a crop that is really great at producing ethanol. Corn is not the only crop to produce ethanol with. It can be made with abundance of cover crops and even cattails, which are really good at filtering wastewater, that we can use them in municipalities. I think an acre of cattails comes close to some 2,000 gallons of ethanol, where corn produces about 480 gallons of ethanol per acre. Sugar beets produce roughly 1,000 gallons per acre. And then we have fodder beets, which are like 10 times bigger than sugar beets. They're like 15 pounds. They're just massive. They don't have as much sugar in them, but they have 20 to 30% more sugar in them due to their size. And you get a substantial amount of ethanol from that. Jerusalem artichokes, cacti. There's all kinds of ways to make ethanol with less water-intensive crops. And that's important because we're trying to save water. We have draining aquifers, so we need to find ways to utilize crops that are effective in raising our cattle, feeding our fish farms. With our dried distillers grains, that's another thing that we can feed to the fish is dried distillers grains. They're a lot more efficient at using the 1 pound weight and making, eatable weight from fish. They're a lot more efficient than cattle. And then in the fish farm, the water can then be used to grow spirulina and algae. And it's this closed loop system that we're working on it. Anyways, moving on. Okay, so challenges, right? So seasonal variability issues of crop waste, right? Land use issues. The food versus fuel fight, which is really political, and it always has to do with corn. I'm not really going to go into it all. I just tried to tell you all the different crops that we can use. What we need to start focusing on is getting away from a monocrop society and start getting into allowing farmers to grow the crops that they need to grow to make money. Water right issues, lack of infrastructure and funding, and that's big. Dedicated pipelines for ethanol, right? So how could this be beneficial for America? We use close to, I think it's 60 or 160 billion gallons. I can't remember how much gasoline we use every year. I think it's like 160 billion. Anyways, slipping my mind right now. But my point is we grow, and I ran these numbers, we grow enough grass across America, just grass clippings, all the grass clippings that you cut in your yard, all the HOAs cut, all the grass clippings on the sides of thousands of miles of county regulated roads. These grass clippings would be enough to cover 100% of our gasoline usage in America. And that's not even including our food waste and our crop residues and our wood residues. We have so much stuff that it's like using gasoline at this point, to me, seems silly.
4 minutes,
but
Tyler.
How many minutes?
3.
3. Okay, moving on. I'm almost done. Dedicated pipelines. All right. So, of course, this is a suppressed green technology, and anybody can be a part of it. All right, so we'll kind of go quick on this one. Crop residues, food waste, wood mills, grasses, genetically enhanced yeast can break everything down at once. So we can pile all these materials into vats We don't have to separate them. Algae and duckweed is another great tool that's coming on big right now, and we can grow protein and we can grow carbohydrates from it. So we can grow some food, and then we can grow starches for making ethanol. And this stuff doubles in size overnight. And seaweed biomass is also possible. And they're even looking at technologies of using sunlight and CO2 through some sort of photocatalyst way to make ethanol with water, from CO2 and water. I'm not sure how that will work, but it'll be cool. Anyways, so you can do this yourself at home. You can make ethanol from your fruit trees, your grapevines, your garden waste with a little bit of enzymes and a little bit of cooking and a small still. You can make fuel for your lawnmower as well. Conclusion, promising fuel. It's been left behind for 80 years. Where would we be if this technology has been allowed to stay present and coherent? But it was not. It's always been pushed out of the limelight. You can even make plastics and rubber out of ethanol, and that's really important because right now we only use petroleum. So, and they're biodegradable. Okay, thank you. I'm done. You know.
Okay,
If anybody,
Tyler. Yeah. So I think we got some like question from Israel, right? Israel, can you?
Yeah, so this is Ezra. I'm so sorry. I was trying to take notes in the chat, but so a major question I have is a question of scale. I feel like I believe in you. I think you're right. I adore this idea of backyard experiments in chemistry. However, it also comes from such a place of entitlement. And my question is, are you proposing that everyone become a backyard chemist? Because it sounds super wasteful and costly to do these things, or is it not? That's one question. Another question I have is, why hasn't this been done already? I mean, what is the overall proposal and what's the science there? And I ask this from a point of scale, like what?
let me just stick to those two, Ezra. I think I answered your second one in the beginning of this PowerPoint, showing you all of the studies from the early 1900s. This was done in scale and on a large scale, and ethanol was the only fuel that was being utilized at that time until prohibition and gasoline made it to the market. You know, Rockefeller found a way to get gasoline into cars. That being said, I'm not proposing that people go out and try to do this unless you want to. I grow a lot of food. A lot of that food doesn't get utilized. I send some to the farmer's market. I put a table out for my neighbors to collect food from, but the residual of that is essentially waste. And so what can I do with that waste instead of just putting it in a garbage can and sending it to a dump? Well, I found that this is a great way to turn that food into fuel. One of my major proponents to this project, if anybody else was wondering, is just the idea that if power were ever to be turned off, being able to make ethanol and run a generator and plug in a ham radio or charge a cell phone or keep perishable medicines from spoiling is critical. And being able to make a fuel where you don't have to rely on somebody else's solar, because in that type of environment, people aren't going to be very friendly. I believe that that's a critical skill. So I'm doing this as more of an outreach to show people that ethanol has always been possible and it's extremely clean. And we can do this on a large scale. Obviously, residential ethanol making isn't efficient for running cars down the road. But if we had ethanol plants every 5 counties where we could take all of our waste as human beings to those plants to then be broken down, fermented, and turned into fuel, that would not be wasteful. That would be using what we have to make another product that doesn't have chemicals in it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I believe in that. Like I believe in what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that there's a disconnect about the possibility of that happening. And one thing I was asking was that biomass was at the bottom of the list as far as in this class, biomass is one of those things that was not taking as seriously as like, nuclear or hydroelectric. And so I'm just wondering like what I don't want to say politically, but I just want to I'm just curious like why is this not a thing? I guess. I don't know. So I appreciate you. I really do.
Yeah, thank you, Ezra. You said it. You said you don't want to say it, but it's all political. Energy is politics. That's the bottom line. Energy is politics, and it always has been. So why this hasn't been a thing? It's going back to the beginning and following where it got off and derailed, and that was through prohibition. Because prior to prohibition, ethanol is what people ran their irons on. Ethanol is what they ran their stoves on. Ethanol is what they ran their lights and their lamps on. Ethanol is what they ran their cars and their tractors on. And then ethanol was removed because it's not something that can be patented. And that's important. So this goes back to politics, and that's where we get gasoline from here on out. That's anybody else have
So
another?
I have a hands-on like information. So when Tyler first reached out to me, and I remember like he asked me like, Professor, I have a lot of Yahwehs. I want to convert that to something else. Could you please help me or something like that? It's like, okay, what is the things you want to do? It's like, oh, how about we make it like we do some fermentation and make it to the biofuel. I said, okay, then you probably a little bit ambitious, but let's try it. So that's how it turned out to be like his capstone project right here. So anyway, he just like convert all his Yard West into fuels, and all the things, ingredients we use, like the chemical or something like that, everything he uses like food grade, right? You use vinegar to break down your food waste, and you cook it, and then you use like baker yeast or brewer's yeast to do the fermentation to produce ethanol. And we also you also got some like zeolite or like molecular sieve from Amazon, right? To do the dehydration. So that's kind of like thing. Yeah.
Any questions from Stockwell? You got a question, bud?
Oh, yes.
Can you hear him? He's got to unmute his mic.
You have to unmute. Yes. Okay.
I apologize. No, I didn't have a question. No, I was just sorting through to try and send a message to the speaker to say it was a fantastic speech, but I enjoyed it very much. That's all. No questions.
No
Appreciate
questions?
it.
Right on. How about Cindy and Adam? Right on. Thanks for sharing.
Oh, Ezra, I saw your comment. Of course, you can send me the email and I can help you to reach out to our agricultural extension station. So we have some faculty member and scientist who's working on that part. So yeah. Is it good? Great.
Thank you, Ezra, for your questions. If nobody else has anything, I guess I'm gonna go ahead and sign off. I appreciate everybody taking the time to log in and listen.
Hold on. Any other questions?
I don't know.
Yeah, one more question right here. Pick it up. Yeah.
That, can you go to the conversion process of bioethanol of phase 5?
Phase 5. You want me to slide back?
Yes.
Phase 5. Okay.
There, you talked about molecular sieves. May I know, like, how does like molecular sieves can remove the water? And
Yeah, you can explain why we use this 3 Armstrong molecular sieves to do the dehydration. You can repeat that again.
Okay, yes. So I use the 3A in size, and the 3A is in the middle. It's the little pores that are on the clay beads or on the zeolite pellets. and there's lots of little pores, and they are the size 3A. So they're 3 angstroms in diameter of an opening, whereas H2O is 2.75 angstroms, and ethanol is 3.6 in size. So when you fill up a liter or a gallon with ethanol that's 182 proof, or 89% or 90%, you then put that molecular sieve into that ethanol in the gallon, and it will absorb the water out of the ethanol. You leave it overnight, you come back, you can pour out the ethanol, take those beads out, and if your ethanol is not quite 200 proof, you can then repeat the process. And then you save your wet beads and then dehydrate them in the oven. Or like I said, it can also be used with a vacuum to pull the moisture out, but I don't have that technology. So then you reuse them until you get 200 proof. And once you're at 200 proof, there's absolutely no water in the ethanol, and it can be used for any purpose that any liquid fuel can be used for. And that's important. If you're doing things with the fuel and you have water in it that you really don't want to have water in, you got to make sure it's 100% alcohol by volume. Did that answer that question?
Thank you. Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah, one more last question from me. So here's like conclusive question. So your background is not like in like chemistry or any other like hard science, so right?
Right.
And your journey to study in the programs, and then you do this kind of like experiment intense projects. How do you feel like?
So
part you have faced.
this was really fun in the beginning. I was really excited, man. Oh man, you saw my little tiny still, I thought that thing was going to really do some stuff for me. And then I found out I just ran into roadblock after roadblock after roadblock trying to get this done. There's quite a bit of science involved in it, and you really have to know how to properly hydrolyze your materials or what you're using. If you're using fruit, you don't really need amylase. You might just want an acid hydrolysis. But if you're using a starch like corn or potatoes, you really want to make sure that contamination is super clean. You can't have any contaminants, and that can be tough when you're using yard waste, that some of it is rotten. And there's nothing wrong with rotten yard waste if you properly pressure cook it and kill those bad bacteria. But if you don't do it properly, then you either overcook it and then you turn all the sugars into furans, which then you won't have any fermentation, or you undercook it and you end up having some really nasty foul odors come out of your fermenter. So I ran into a lot of issues where I failed at making ethanol, or I made lactic acid, or I made some weird chemical that Professor Ming knows, but it basically smells like vomit. It was really grotesque. And but I also spent a lot of time building my equipment, and I was really, you just kind of get into it, and then you realize before you know it, you're a bit over your head and you're pulling your hair out, but you can't stop until it's done the right way.
Great. I really thank you for like sharing your experiences with all of us. Okay, any other questions? If not, then we will call it a day, and I will see you guys in 2 weeks. Okay, good. Hey, have a good day, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.